Okay, hello everyone. This morning I have the very great privilege to be joined by Mr. Hani Musavi, colleague of mine, final year medical student at the University of Warwick and host of a new medical podcast, or perhaps not always medical. We'll speak about that in the very near future in conversation with Hani. Hani, thank you for joining me this morning.
No worries, Ollie. Thanks for having me. So it was the inevitable collaborations finally happened, right?
You say that, like, we've got colleagues. I was thinking about this just before we came on. Joe, who runs obviously GradMed Journey, I think we've been trying to sort something out for years, but it's just not, it's not quite happened.
You can never help it, and just sometimes just life gets in the way, doesn't it?
It does. Although we've started, we're on the same rotations at the moment, so something may come to fruition. So today, I think there's a lot of ground potentially to cover. It's going to be a bit of a more informal discussion, less of a structured interview. So there's lots of different avenues we can talk about. I guess from my end, we could just launch into your motivations for starting your podcast. I've got a few questions about that, and then have a bit of a free-form discussion.
Yeah, that's fine.
Sure.
So obviously the podcast I started up a few months back, kind of with the height of coronavirus and everyone being in lockdown. So you had two avenues, right? I could either do something useful or I could go into baking, which I think most of the world did. But, at this point, my waistline really didn't need that. So podcasting it was. And then I think, so I've always been someone who's been quite opinionated. And I've always, liked engaging with current affairs, topical stuff. And I think it would have been a crime to just limit that to one or two people, or just like vent out on a WhatsApp chat, because a lot of times people might have the same views, people might have differing views. I think the best way of trying to address that or kind of break down barriers of understanding is to actually just get your voice out there, just get talking about different themes, different topics. So that's obviously one positive avenue. I think I wanted to use it as a tool to kind of express my opinions about things, and then B, obviously use that as a starting point to just get conversation flowing, really. I don't think there's necessarily a wrong opinion on anything, within reason, obviously.
Yeah.
Within reason. But it's in the first way of kind of breaking down any misconceptions is to just start talking about them, really. So that's kind of why I like the idea of podcasting, because podcasting gives you that avenue to just kind of put your views into the 15, 20, half hour slot. I think it's just gives people enough of an opportunity to say, yeah, okay, these are the ideas that this person has. Let's talk about them a bit more. Let's explore them. So I think that can only benefit people, really.
For sure. I suppose, and I guess the major question that I had was, as you said, there are lots of things that you could have done, whether that was baking or starting a podcast, or you could have, started writing a blog, or writing micro poems or something. Why the podcast format specifically?
I think because, in this day and age, a lot of people like content which they don't really have to overexert themselves in receiving, right? So when you listen to a podcast, it's relatively energy, it requires minimal energy, doesn't it? Minimal expenditure. You just put your headphones in and just listen to a voice. That's all it is. As opposed to picking up a book and then flicking through pages, or sitting down and watching a 2-hour video, for example. Podcast is something, people can just take in little chunks and, listen as and when they want. So I think in terms of me, like, I only started listening to podcasts about a year and a half ago, but really from that period of time, I just found it to be more beneficial in terms of kind of media consumption or content consumption. So obviously I'd want to give out content which I would want to receive as well. So I think podcast format really gives me that avenue. And yeah, okay, you mentioned kind of why not write a poem or a book and that kind of thing. I mean, it's definitely something which I considered at one point, but I think you can be more expressive through voice. and you can definitely bring out a lot more of your character through a podcast, not through 15 or 20 minutes of talking. And I think that's what I've tried to do. If you compare my first one to kind of as they've progressed,
Yeah,
definitely you ease into it, don't you? I think you can even testify to this with your YouTube
for
videos.
sure.
Like if you look at the stuff you did at the start versus now, you're more free flowing, aren't you? You're more at ease with what you're presenting. So I think definitely that I kind of wanted to show a little bit of my character and also give people content that's just easy to consume.
Good answer. And I guess the final point to be made before kind of opening up is it seems a wasted opportunity for certainly the viewers perhaps on my channel that are watching. How would you, in one or two lines, how would you sell what you do, to an audience? What is In Conversation with Hani? What are you trying to achieve?
That's a good one. I suppose what I'm trying to achieve is a wider understanding of topics which aren't either touched upon due to lack of time or lack of accessibility and understanding. So I'm just basically with this podcast trying to bring to light topics which I think will benefit the medical and non-medical community alike, and do it in such a way that it's easy to understand and easy to invoke discussion going forward. I
Amazing.
think that's probably
It's a very succinct but appropriate answer.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me I'll pull up my thing of notes here. Okay. I do have another one if you're happy to just plow on.
Yeah, go for it.
Which is that I perhaps bumbled through my introduction a little bit and introduced it as a medical or pseudo-medical podcast. But that's really not a fair assessment of In Conversation with Hani, is it? I mean, the temptation, I think, would be for, we're final year medical students, almost as established a medical student as one can be.
Sure.
And it would have been perhaps easier to do a revision podcast or interviewing and doctors or something. The content that you make isn't overtly medical. You're not limited, I suppose, in that scope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I deliberately did it that way because I think there's already a plethora of medical podcasts. So the Royal Society of Medicine has their own podcast. Other societies, they do podcasts. Other kind of prominent doctors, they have their own thing where they're just discussing pure medical topics. But I think with who I'm trying to appeal to, that being kind of both the medical and non-medical community, there's only so much that I can talk about without losing part of the fan base, if you get what I mean.
Yeah.
So I mean, when kind of you talk about the Royal Society podcast, they're very much geared to a particular theme, right? So they'll talk about, I don't know, cardiovascular health for one day, and they'll talk you through a case study. Yeah, to an extent, that's important for us because we need to know that in terms of how to manage and diagnose. But for non-medical members of the public, if I was just to keep bringing that thing out there, what benefit would I add? So when I do talk about medical topics, I do it kind of in a sphere where both medical and non-medical listeners can relate to it. So kind of when I did my first podcast, I talked about this idea of a political pandemic. So what I wanted to do with that is, partly touch on what coronavirus is, how it started, kind of origins and that, but also how this relates to wider society. Because I think it's the element of relatability that I wanted to bring out. And, whilst obviously managing angina is an important thing for a lot of people, they'll never need to know that. Well, kind of what they would need to know is, okay, we've got all these public health measures going on at the moment. We've got X, Y, and Z people saying X, Y, and Z different things. How does that relate to me? How can I understand this? What's the rationale? So when I do talk about medical topics, that's kind of the avenue that I'm going down. And then kind of as an aside to that, things such as like productivity, philosophy, these are just things that I find interesting. And, if I've derived some benefit from it, why not podcast that? Why not make that into an audio format? And maybe some other people might relate to it the same.
Perfect. I mean, it's a very sensible answer, you know, and I relate to that a lot. That latter, the latter element you just mentioned about not being constrained almost to one theme, or the freedom and flexibility to be able to talk about what motivates you in the moment, right? Because your ideas, your interests change. And we were talking just before this about, I've just gone through a period of rebranding myself on my own projects and channels and things, and one of the major reasons for that wasn't the only reason, but one of the big players was that I decided if I made it a more personal brand, so the product that I'm selling is, or the character that I'm selling is more personal, and what I'm musing on and what I can bring to the table, it introduces, as you say, a lot more flexibility, because it's in conversation with Hani, right? It's not, you know, medical studying with Dr. Hani, or you know, you're not constrained from your title. It's very much,
Precisely.
you are the product.
That's it. That's it. I think kind of just you raise an interesting point, because you want to add that element of kind of being personable, right? You want people to relate to you. So kind of when you started, kind of just bring it over to your side now. Kind of
Sure.
when you started off with postgrad medic, right? Kind of what was the incentive for starting that all those years back?
Yeah, so all those years back, that would have been, when did we start? 2017. We would have started medical school.
Yeah,
Yeah,
2017.
and I started, wow, we're into getting near the end of 2020. I
We
started
made it
right,
out of this year alive, hopefully,
yeah,
touch wood.
well, not yet. There could still, stuff can still
So
happen.
we're
But
almost there.
yeah, so I started right before we came to university. So it must have been the summer of 2017. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess there were a couple of elements there. The first was, as I'm sure you experienced, because we do the same course and we've been through the same processes, applying to medical school, particularly, I found graduate entry medicine is a convoluted and not always particularly accessible process. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you'd kind of think that in theory, this process that supplies your nation's doctors would be something approaching, if not equitable, equal opportunity. It would be easy to understand. You know,
Mm-hmm.
the requirements should in theory be open to everyone. And I came straight from my undergraduate degree, and I thought, you know, I'm studying a bioscience subject at a reasonably reputable university. Why am I finding this process so difficult to understand? You
Mm-hmm.
know, this
What did
application
you
process.
What did you find difficult about it? Anything specific, or just like the general side of it?
What I found particularly was that not only are a lot of the conditions that seem to be attached to going to medical school, there's a layer of mystery and sort of fog that seems to surround everything about entry grades and UKCAT scores. And I remember having a conversation with a university that will remain nameless when it was coming to applying, um, and I rung them up and was just asking about their grade requirements, and it was saying, you know, publicly you advertise that you need a 2-1, for example, for your uh, for your applications to medical school. And on the phone, I was told in no small or no uncertain terms that, yeah, we say we want a 2-1, but really we want a first, and you've not really got a chance unless you've got first. And
Mm.
that to me is just, it's an
Yep.
example of one of the, like, there's all this legwork that all of these candidates have to do independently. And it's the same when you're thinking about your UCAT scores and so on. How do you know whether you're competitive for a particular school? It's not
Mm.
it's not really publicly available information. Um, and just
Sure.
navigating that process, I found quite convoluted and not very streamlined. So all I was trying to do was capture, you know, this is what it's like to go, at least from my own perspective, and I can't speak for anyone who
For
isn't
sure.
me. I thought it would just be useful because, as far as I could tell, it didn't exist at the time, and I don't think it did exist at the time. Someone going through that process.
No, it's a very fair point that you raise. I think kind of part of the convoluted nature of it is because it's such a competitive process as well. I think
Mm,
once you get into the graduate entry space, I think there are even less places available, and then
sure.
kind of even more applicants. So kind of this convoluted nature making you second guess yourself. Oh, did I get a good enough UCAT score? It almost, in a way, it kind of helps with the application process, doesn't it? Because it filters people out on maybe on the basis that they didn't need to be filtered out on in the first place.
Mm,
But yeah, no, definitely, it's just an interesting point. So you started it to address some of kind of the imbalances and the uncertainty in the
mm,
process, as you say. Kind of what took it further then? Because obviously, once you got to past that point,
mm.
you began to expand. You began doing interviews with other specialty or specialists,
Yeah, yeah.
making actual educational content. So what was the catalyst going forward there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big driver, when we were talking, as you said, in terms of different content, the big driver for me, or the thing that started picking up momentum, was this interview prep content to try and deal with some of the hidden curriculum problem when you're applying to medical school. You're expected, when you turn up at your medical interview, 9 times out of 10, to be able to talk about the pillars of medical ethics and a bit about the history of the NHS. And no one ever tells you this stuff. It's just kind of
No.
accepted in the culture somewhere that this is the stuff you're expected to be able to talk about, right? But
Yep.
obviously, if you don't have anyone to tell you that, you
Hmm.
how can you ever know? And people don't know. So
No, of course.
that prompted the creation of this interview preparation content. And that's something that I continue to enjoy working on. And then, as you said, there have been other things. There have been education stuff, which I actually haven't done as much of for a couple of quite particular reasons. And then more recently, as you say, interviews with specialists, and it's actually in a more vodcasty, if you like a just a, like we're having now, this
Yeah,
free form conversation,
for sure.
just to try and get that. I feel like there's a lot of wisdom, right, locked up in experienced doctors. And something that does occur to me, and I'm sure this is something that you've experienced, is that when you go to a conference, for
Hmm.
example, or you go to see a particular speaker, this person does probably the same talk at the same conference, um, every couple of years, and it'll be listened to by the 50, 100, 200 people that are in the room, when
Hmm.
there's an enormous amount of benefit that could be derived from not only people who are not able to attend those conferences for a great many reasons. I think
Hmm.
there's also a lot of benefit for those that are outside the target audience, particularly when I'm thinking about helping 15 and 16-year-olds try and make their mind up on whether medicine might be a good idea for them or not.
Sure.
I'm very much a believer, to plagiarize a phrase from Simon Fleming, in "You can't be what you can't see." And
Yeah, that's a very good
well,
statement.
and I think exposing people when they are younger to, maybe someone can't visualize themselves as a doctor, but maybe that's because they don't know that a doctor can be a cardiothoracic surgeon, can be a public health doctor, can be, working in community sexual health or something. If they just
Hmm.
conceptualize a doctor as being this, say, a busy person who runs around in hospitals listening to people's lungs, um, I'm
I
kind
mean,
of,
that's us as F1s in a few months'
yeah,
time, isn't it?
yeah,
But no, yeah, that's a very fair point. So I think it's again you're bringing that element of relatability, aren't you? You want people there who other or kids of 15, 16, like you said, and even people in the undergrad space at the moment say, okay, this is their career path. I can emulate that. I think that's a good thing. That's a good thing for sure. Kind of also another big thing that you're into is widening accessibility.
Mm.
So, kind of, what do you think are the barriers at the moment to kind of everyone having an equal access to medical school? Because obviously, the process for all intents and purposes is as transparent as it can be.
Mm.
Like as in you apply for your UKCAT, you apply to your universities and what have you. But
Yeah.
kind of what aspect of widening accessibility really strikes a chord with you? Kind of why focus on it?
Yeah, for sure. I think as good little medical students, we're always taught to stratify, right? So
Oh yeah, yeah.
let's if you would grant me that there are perhaps modifiable elements and non-modifiable elements, and
Mm-hmm.
the non-modifiable elements first might be problems that we don't know exist with the process and we are unaware of them and may
Mm-hmm.
never become aware of them, but they may be there.
For
Things
sure.
that we can't change. You may talk about things like systemic, racial, political biases, all of these things where potentially there's something we can do about it. I'm a bit wary of the evidence that suggests, the implicit biases can be modified through training. I don't think the evidence is particularly good for that at the moment with the tools we have. That may
Mm-hmm.
change,
Yeah.
which is a bit of a defeatist stance, but there we go. And then in terms of the modifiable stuff, the stuff that I think we can have an impact on. As I said before, there's this idea of the hidden curriculum, things that just by virtue of kind of being in the medical sphere and applying to medical school, you are tacitly expected to know about as an applicant. There's obviously insight into medicine and contacts. So much of it is networking, right? Even once you become a doctor. And if you maybe don't have a doctor in your family or someone connected to the health system, accessing even the shadowing to investigate a career in medicine can be incredibly difficult, actually a lot more difficult than I realized at the
Oh
beginning
yeah.
of this process. And obviously if you can't investigate a career, then you're not very likely to pursue that career.
For sure. I think if you
And
keep seeing doors which are just closed into your face every time, I'll just you reminded me when I was 16 and kind of considering applying first time round. I must have applied as a volunteer to so many different hospitals before one took me, and even then, I wasn't really doing the most medical of jobs. It was just to be in that environment, just to get the opportunity. But I think a few years back, a few years later, kind of once I did get it, I was visited my old colleagues, the ones I used to work with back in sixth form, and they showed me a list of applications this high, just about people who want work experience. And like you can't give that to everyone. I think that's a real big issue, and I think people also feel that unless they're in a hospital environment, you know, or unless they're holding a scalpel or a leg in theatre, that means they haven't experienced medicine. I think medicine is so much more than that. There's all this kind of like the softer skills, communicating with patients,
yeah,
kind of just holistic stuff, which no one really talks about. Because when you've probably experienced this as well, people are sat in interview waiting rooms and all they're talking about is, I was with this surgeon, I was with this doctor.
yeah,
You kind of you get lost in it almost. So yeah, I think definitely that's something which needs to be addressed. The accessibility of work experience and then what work experience actually entails. Because being a doctor is just obviously so much more than just diagnosing and treating someone, isn't it?
yeah. But it's a case of, I suppose, medical application systems, they have to have some measurable on which we assess people, whether or not that's the UKCAT or getting a set amount of work experience. Even using Warwick, where we both go, as an example, if they put a deliverable on, we want 70 or 80 hours of work experience over 2 or 3 experiences. And that's not a bad thing to do. Obviously, you want future doctors who have sought out these experiences and experienced a range of things, and they specify hands-on care, which is obviously a really important thing. But at the same time, we obviously exist in a system where, as we've just said, access to these experiences is unevenly distributed. And again, I don't think it's not a societal evil as such. It's just a consequence of the natural, or not natural, but the structures we have. You know, if you're a doctor and you've got a 15-year-old or even a 25-year-old who is trying to get some work experience, of course you would just say to your buddy, you know, can my kid or my relative or whatever come and shadow you for a few weeks? And if it's one of your work buddies, yeah, of course you would do that in many situations if you could. And it's the same, without diving into heavily, I feel the same way about things like private education. You know, you can kind of hold many views on that, but we exist in a system that has these things, and most people actually, if they have the resources to do these things, tend to engage with them for better or worse. And it's as a consequence of these things, I think.
I mean, we've seen it, haven't we? No, yeah, again, don't want to touch too much on the private education thing, but
it's a big topic.
Kind of even like the recent A-level scandal just proves it, doesn't it? You know, certain schools or certain individuals, maybe they were unaffected as much as other parts. I think, it's not something which will be addressed overnight. It's not kind of, these things are systemic. They've been here for a while. So to change a system, it requires a period of time. But, you know, that's outside of our realm of expertise. We'll leave that to the experts, as it were.
Well, on that topic, then I'm going to bounce back, because we were talking about a topical issue, things in the news. Fake news was something that came up when we were talking before. So
fake news.
Good old fake news. And I mean, in the height of the coronavirus pandemic, when 5G will kill you if the corona doesn't, and your masks are
absolutely
your masks
a violation of your human rights.
Well, they've got chips in made by Bill Gates, Hani. Like, what, you know, why?
No, I mean, clearly because I want to download Microsoft Word into my actual physical hard drive of my brain, right?
Yeah, well, Neuralink, we've just seen Elon Musk's thing going on, but fake news. So do you think, let's say, medical students, doctors, allied healthcare professionals, do they, if they're existing in a public space or otherwise, do they have a duty to address these things, almost like a duty of care?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's not just, your duty of care isn't just limited to when you see a patient for about a 5 or 10 minute consultation. Or, you know, as doctors, kind of, we're privileged to kind of education and knowledge about topics which kind of the rest of the public don't necessarily have. And as part of that, I think we have a duty to address any, you know, incorrect information which is going out, or any kind of potentially damaging information which is going out. I mean, you know, we're not going to bring any names, but certain people have been recommending bleach for coronavirus or zapping it with rays. We've also had instances where you can simply pray it away. I mean, if it was that simple, it would have gone, you know, it wouldn't have even arrived in the first place.
Sure.
So we definitely, I think we do have a duty to address it. And even when we're talking about things like masks, we're talking about things like dexamethasone, or was it acyclovir at one point, which was touted as a potential treatment, or remdesivir.
Remdesivir.
And then everyone and their dog wanting to go and get a prescription for it. So things like that, I think the public, either due to the lack of knowledge or due to the fact that they just want a solution quickly, tend to have a tendency to want to believe this kind of thing. You can understand it really. If the coronavirus has really impacted a lot of people, it's kept people homebound for a few months, lost people their employment, people's mental health has suffered. I mean, luckily we're kind of being in the medical sector, we've still managed to go out, even if it was just a hospital. But you see your colleagues, you see other people, you interact with it. People unfortunately have lost loved ones to the disease itself. So when someone comes in touting a cure, touting a solution, naturally the tendency is to want to believe it. But where that becomes damaging is when what is being spouted is absolute nonsense. And I think nowadays as well, it doesn't take much for misinformation to be propagated. All it starts is just one person sending something on WhatsApp, posting something on Facebook,
Yeah.
and then that does the rounds. And before you know it, 1 million people have seen this, and they're all convinced, yeah, this is it. Like the 5G thing, for example. So where we can, I think definitely we should address it.
I do then have a follow-up question, right? Because I want to say that it was in Trafalgar recently we saw it was almost like a say no to masks rally or something like that. With obviously, I think most people support freedom of association, and you have even if what you're saying is fundamentally stupid or potentially damaging, you have a right to assemble and say these things, right? But
Of course.
the factor that interested me was that we had doctors and nurses present and speaking at these rallies. So essentially, I think my question is, are these people, do you think, are they misguided? Do they genuinely believe this stuff? Are they trying to just stir people up? Like, what's going on there?
That's an interesting one. So, like you said, you got freedom of association. Anyone can freedom of assembly or whatever. You can all get together, say what you need to in the public space. Maybe they might know something that we don't, but kind of the majority consensus is that masks are important, and I think you can just even look at it from a basic level. The more barriers that you have in front of you, the less likely that any kind of respiratory droplet will seep from that space. And we all know that kind of at this point in time, that's the main mechanism, coughing, sneezing, which coronavirus is transmitted. So I think the mask situation is a non-issue.
Sure.
However, I think for example, obviously you've got doctors, nurses there. Maybe they might vehemently believe in one aspect because of their own experience. Like, I can't tell people what their experience is or what it should be. But I think when you're talking about a majority and you're talking about a consensus, not just in the UK, but across Europe, even in America, different states, Asia, some countries in Asia, they were wearing masks even before coronavirus. Basically you see in like China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, these places, even masks are commonplace because they just, it's the idea of you don't want to transmit anything or whatever. So, I mean, if we're using that as even the most trivial, the most basic of examples, why would you not wear a mask when you've got kind of one of the most deadliest pandemics that we've had for a while? Like I say, it's a non-issue, or it shouldn't be an issue, but people have got their own motivations for saying what they do. And in the same way that some people think that masks are a bad thing, I think on the other side of it, we've got freedom of speech here, don't we? So we should equally challenge it and say, no, these are important for this time frame.
Sure. I mean, that was kind of the root at what I was trying to get at. Let's say that I think we do by now, and I don't think that we've had this perhaps all the way through for obvious reasons, but there is now, as you say, a pretty solid consensus that masks are generally speaking a good idea, right? And let's say we have this body of evidence, Public Health England, or what was Public Health England, and will be another story, coming out with all this data. So we have this consensus, much like we might do for the use of any drug. Despite that, and as medical professionals and health professionals, you'd hope that your duty would be to promote, this good body of evidence and promote the guidelines, as it were.
For sure.
You've then got these very qualified, I think one of the people speaking at this rally was a surgeon, worked in the NHS for like 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there should be any consequences, professional or otherwise, for people who, you're in your role as a medical professional speaking against this advice?
I think it's hard to say that, because you get down the rabbit hole of, okay, if I disagree with you, then I'm going to be sanctioned or I'm going to be penalized for it. I think that's a really, really bad state of affairs. I think everyone is entitled to their opinion, and I think with regards to the coronavirus, at least, we'll use this in context. The evidence is changing every day. Kind of what was constant, or what was considered best practice a month ago, is different to what is considered best practice
For
now.
sure.
So that means this is a dynamic, it's an evolving process. To sanction people or to penalize them for an opinion, that leads to a very kind of bad situation, or potentially bad situation. I think what we have now at the moment is, fair enough, have your opinion, but at the same time, you need to give people the room to grow and to actually express that. I think just shutting down an opinion or whatever, it doesn't achieve anything, because the more you shut or something, or the more you oppress something, it's going to come back to bite you in some way or another later on. So I think, for all intents and purposes, give everyone the sphere to say what they need, but at the same time, challenge it strongly, challenge it with good evidence, and challenge it sincerely. I think that's the best way.
It's really refreshing I happen to agree with you, but I didn't want to present my own thoughts before I asked you the question to lead you on anything, but that's very refreshing. I happen to hold a similar view personally, and very much, I think, what's the phrase? Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say. And if you force, say, these views underground, I think they will often just resurface. Either, well, people are having these discussions in a place where you can see them, but if you force them underground, they will continue to happen, but where you can't see them.
Exactly.
Which no one wants.
No,
I think.
Sorry, go on.
Well, the last thing that I was going to be interested in talking to you about, Hani, was, and this is almost changing tack entirely, but I think it's worth discussing given that the format that we're having this conversation in. One of my bugbears in medicine and about the way our medical system works is that there is often a pressure to complete projects or to form new initiatives, because new initiatives sound better in an interview than improving existing initiatives. So say you've started a podcast, and I think I was talking to, I think it was Johan Maluana, the Medics Academy founder, about this, and he was saying that there's almost this elephant graveyard of medical student and doctor projects that they sort of started them, did their initiative for the minimum amount of time required, talked about it in their interview, and then dropped it and moved on. How have you, because obviously this is going to be the 5th episode.
This is the 5th one,
yeah. And actually producing 5 episodes of a podcast is a lot more work than I think most people appreciate it is.
It's more than I appreciated to start with. I didn't think it would be as taxing, but when you talk about the kind of the research that goes into it, the kind of the content you produce, the post-production, it's a big process.
It is. And what I wanted to get at is, I guess 2 things. The first is that how have you tried to approach gaining some traction for your podcast, trying to get it out there and into the ears of a potential audience? And then secondly is, how have you kept yourself motivated? Because often that's the thing we see waxing.
Yeah. So kind of just tackling about how I managed to gain traction. So I think the big thing is just using social media to get your content out there, because social media has its bad points, but also has a lot of good. So if you're a content developer or content producer, it's kind of the best sphere for you. So I'm using Instagram, I'm using Twitter, trying to publicize these things, just maintaining an active presence on that. And yeah, we're building up slowly. So, I mean, I've got listeners obviously here in the UK, America, Japan, Denmark. So it's good. Like you're seeing this, it's kind of reaching audiences, which I didn't necessarily think it would at this early stage. But again, that's not good enough. Like we want to be getting to a point where we're getting a consistent amount of listeners on every episode, like the minute it drops, kind of thing. So I think the best thing with that is kind of leading into your second point is to just keep producing content that you're happy with. So when I first started it, I was thinking, I should produce something every week, get my name out there, get into the spheres, people know who I am, what I'm talking about. But firstly, the quality will suffer horrendously.
Sure.
Secondly, you'll burn out because you're just thinking, what is the point of doing this, or just talking into a microphone for what? And then third as well, it's unsustainable.
Yeah.
So I kind of, obviously towards the start of the podcasting, it was kind of, in the height of Corona, everyone was in lockdown. People might have had potentially more time. But then I think obviously, first and foremost, we're medical students. We're going into medical sphere. Like this is our priority. Our priority is to make sure kind of we get good grades, we become competent or more than competent in whatever skills we have. But I think for me, it's rather than producing nonsense or subpar quality every week, I think what I'm doing now is just once a month. And I'll pick a topic which is either pertinent to what's going on in terms of current affairs, something medical related, philosophy related, but whatever I'm talking about is something which I'm genuinely passionate about. And I structure it in such a way that it doesn't even feel like you're working, or it doesn't even feel like you're doing anything taxing. You're just literally putting your ideas out onto a microphone, and you're producing good quality. And I think that's the main important thing, because you talked about it yourself. Like if you have this whole like graveyard, almost living graveyard of just deadbeat projects, but what is the point of that? If you want to do something, you should have a passion for it. I think kind of you can probably attest to this. If it wasn't because you genuinely enjoyed what you're doing in terms of kind of Oliver and Med and how it was postgrad before, that project would have died down like 2 months into first year.
For sure.
So I think it's definitely finding something that you're passionate about. I mean, look, at the end of the day, the CV is never going to be enough of a motivator for you to do what you need to do, right? Because at the end of the day, CV requirements change throughout your career and what have you. I think it's just a case of finding your niche, finding something you enjoy, and finding something which you can produce good quality for. That's the main thing.
Perfect. I think that's a really admirable approach. And that's, I think I want to echo something that you said there. And this is something throughout the last few years I've definitely fallen into the trap of myself, is that it is almost invariably better, as you say, to have fewer deliverables, but have them be of higher content, because not only do you want to be consistent and engaging, but the bar is so high, right? For independent content. Even if we look at something like YouTube, for example, the domain in which I primarily create, actually we are somewhat past the days of people being able to just point their mobile phone at something and kind of immediately have a presence. And that's how it was perhaps at the beginning. But now, even you can see behind me, right? I've got this big light here.
You've got the full setup.
Yeah, but back here there's a 4K shooting DSLR there. There's like light things over there and a microphone here and stuff. And quality, particularly on very established platforms, is a huge thing. And I would much rather listen to, as you say, a podcast that comes out once a month, that is well produced, that I can kind of tolerate, it is thoughtful and of high enough quality that I can tolerate it being beamed into my ears for an hour, rather than trying to churn something out twice a week or every week that is underproduced And I want to know that the authors believe in what they've done, because if
For
they're
sure.
not passionate about what they're doing, then why would I be passionate about what they're doing? Why would
Yeah,
I give them
exactly.
my
I think
time?
it's like you get out what you put in, really. So, I mean, even if you were producing this kind of subpar quality, the audience base will dwindle very quickly,
Yeah,
and you'll find yourself kind of in a rut. You spend all this time doing all this content, but then no one's consuming it. And I think it would be very detrimental to your own sanity, wouldn't it?
for sure.
Um, so yeah, no, I think especially it's funny you mentioned about the YouTube, yeah, because right at the start it was just selfie or a video, or just like literally the content was someone just zooming into an item or an object, and
For
like that
sure.
got like a million views. But now it's you need the smooth transitions, you need the background music, you need timestamps, you need all of this
Yeah.
stuff. So for you, it's a very taxing thing. Even for me, like I didn't factor this in, but obviously sound quality as well. You need to make sure that it's not too long of a podcast, because
Yeah,
otherwise people they're not going to listen to it. You need to make sure that there's a soft element of music in the background, all of
for
this
sure.
stuff. So yeah, man, I feel your pain.
Feel the pain. Don't underestimate post-production, people at home,
Honestly,
and
yeah.
and all the behind the scenes work.
Production for sure, especially when you're doing it yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
I think you wanted to just do your standard career thing.
Oh yeah,
So
we'll do that because
let
we spend 5
let
minutes. Okay.
let me
Um,
let me start. Kind of what's the future hold for Ollie Burton Med and Ollie Burton as the individual?
do you want me to have a go?
Have a go. Come on.
um, the future for Ollie Burton and Ollie Burton Med, Ollie Burton the individual. I think we all operate in peaks and troughs, right? For motivation for particular things,
For
and
sure.
something that I have found very helpful in medical school. He says as he kicks the table is having a long-term goal. I think that's really important. Or certainly it has been for me. So as many of you know out there, as Hani, I'm sure you know, I've been thinking about a career in neurosurgery, which is pretty competitive. It's a slightly different training pathway to a lot of specialties,
Mm-hmm.
just because I guess it gives them the chance to be different. Um,
Yep.
and even though I'm currently, maybe only maybe 85% invested in a career in neurosurgery, I have found the fact that I am interested in that, it kind of sets out the pathway of things that I need to be doing, you know,
Mm-hmm.
doing my research and your posters, and all of these things are always going to be good. And I find that having that long-term motivator is really helpful in setting short-term goals. But more and more recently, I've been thinking that if I was going to do, because neurosurgery is incredibly competitive, and even amazing people much smarter than me struggle to get the training.
Mm.
I've been thinking more, if I was going to do maybe another type of surgery, or I was going to do internal medicine, I'm really attracted to pediatrics, actually,
Really?
yeah, if I was going to do medicine, maybe acute medicine, pediatrics. How about you? What are you thinking about?
So definitely surgical as opposed to medical at this point. Again, like the degree itself, it gives you decent exposure to a lot of things. I think I just find myself more at home and more enjoying kind of the operating theatre environment
Yeah,
and that kind of thing. So for me, it's kind of a toss up at the moment. So I've got an interest in cardiothoracics. That's definitely one of the things. And like neurosurgery, the training program differs slightly. So it's kind of more emphasis on ST1 entry, and even then, it's super competitive. Not ridiculously competitive. I think there were about 1 year there were only 8 jobs in the country, and I think almost 100 people had applied.
yeah,
So it just gives you an indicator. I mean, if that didn't pan out, I think orthopedics is an interesting one for me as well.
strong.
Enjoying those two. I think we'll see. But like you said, completely agree. Just have a long term goal. and use that to just set tasks in the short term.
Yeah, even if you only have the granularity, I guess, of medicine or surgery, right? You know, that can, because this is something when I'm speaking to younger students and maybe early years medical students, they're like, you know, you're lucky in that you kind of know what you want to do, but I don't know what I want to do. So like, what do I
Yeah.
do? You know, and I think they're worried about just firing off in all directions. And
Mm.
I think
But I think
sorry, go on.
there's a lot. Sorry. I think there's a lot of emphasis put on like you have to know what you want to do the minute you step foot into medical
Yeah,
school. And that's not the case. There's a reason why you do so many different rotations. There's a reason why there are so many different societies which exist. They give you exposure to this and the other. I think the main thing is just as long as you're driven and as long as you're opportunistic, those are the best qualities you can have.
yeah,
And that's not just in medicine, just in anything really. Then over time you'll find your niche and you'll find what suits you.
yeah, yeah. Embrace opportunity, I think, when it comes up, and you never know what it's going to be, all right? And but
Of
most of
course.
these things are transferable. You know, if you do a poster in cardiology or something, you know, you do some research, you know, in cardiology, but or in, say, something completely unrelated, like I don't know, acute medicine or something, and you want to do cardiothoracics. No one's ever going to sniff at, work you've done,
No, of course
right?
not. Of
and
course
and
not.
I think people don't, the skills are transferable. It's not the particular, obviously, I guess if it is related to the specific thing you want to do, then fine. But the value is in, much as you must have done with your podcast, it's in as much learning how to do these things as anything
As
else.
what you actually put out, yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. Well, it'll be interesting to catch up in a few years and see where life has
a few
taken us,
years
eh?
down the line.
A few years down the line. Hopefully we manage to stick on course, eh?
Firmly in the pockets of big pharma,
Uh,
sipping cocktails on
yeah,
a beach somewhere.
exactly. Attending rallies with controversial viewpoints, eh?
Well, obviously, I've got a book to promote, Hani. Like, got
Yeah,
stuff to do.
exactly. I have a lifestyle here.
um, okay, well, that's probably where we'll wrap. I think it's been a
Yeah,
really
sounds good.
interesting conversation.
It has. Yeah, very good start to the bank holiday morning, hey?
Yeah, make the most of the rest of the day.
Yeah,
Okay,
likewise.
so Hani, how can people catch up with your podcast? How can they find your stuff?
Cool. So I'm available on kind of many of the big podcast streaming services, so Spotify, Apple, Anchor, just in conversation with Hani, and you'll be able to access that. And just follow on Twitter and Instagram as well. So at Twitter's at In Convo with Hani, because obviously we have a character restriction there. And then on Instagram, it's In Conversation with Hani. But basically, I'll just post promotional clips, or just how you can keep up to date with what I'm doing with the podcast.
Perfect. And all of those will be linked both in the video description and overlaid when this video goes live on YouTube as well.
Nice one.
Mr. Hani Musavi, take care.
Thank you, sir. All the
Thank you
best.
very much. Goodbye.